and welcome to Neon Liberalism, a weekly podcast where I, Samantha Hancocksley, and my friend and colleague Jason Brigman talk about the events of the day from a liberal perspective and try to cut through the noise just a little bit. This week, we're going to be talking about, you guessed it, Luigi Mangione, also known as the Adjuster, also known as the United Healthcare CEO killer, which seems to be relevant for a lot of things. For the question of gun violence, for the question of healthcare and the health industry in this country, for broader questions about the role of political violence going forward. So I guess before getting into any of that, what happened, like specifically, Jason, do you want to try to talk about what actually do we know at the present moment about these events?
The CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, was walking away or to, I think to, an investors meeting in Manhattan and got shot in the back. And this young man, Luigi Mangione, is the suspect. And I'm not sure how much beyond that we can say with extreme confidence. Presuming the suspect is the party actually involved in this event. You know, I don't know. I don't know what you can say, but those are the basic facts.
The basic facts. Brian Thompson is shot, like you say, while walking down the street in New York City. Pretty soon, some surveillance video comes out where you can see the shooter shooting him at close range, appears to be using a suppressed pistol of some kind. Shortly after that, more surveillance footage comes out. He's at the shooter, I mean, not the CEO, is at a Starbucks nearby. He looks kind of cute. That plays well on social media. Bullet casings are recovered from the scene. They say deny, defend, depose on them, which is almost certainly a reference to tactics used by health insurance companies to deny claims. There's a tremendous outpouring on social media, not in support of the CEO, obviously, but in support of the shooter. People are writing fan fiction about him. People are giving him silly nicknames, one of which I've mentioned. A lot of people are just like, yeah, this is great. These people had it coming. I mean, just from personal experience, I was talking to a cashier and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, "Great, haven't you heard a CEO got shot?" And she was
Wow.
just like, yeah, like visibly jazzed and excited about these events. So that's the initial thing that happens. Oh, there's one other amazing little detail, right? The bag of Monopoly money that they find his backpack, I believe in Central Park, and it's full of Monopoly money.
Did
What
they
that
did they
means,
definitely tie that to him? Are they sure about that? I don't,
I don't know for sure. I think yeah, I guess we'll find out.
let's maybe let that detail slide.
Yeah, that might be a little too good to be true. In any event, a few days later, a cashier at a McDonald's, I believe, is serving somebody a burger and thinks, "No, you look like the guy." And they call the police. The police come and arrest this person, Luigi Mangione, currently a suspect in the killing. We don't know for certain yet, but this police certainly seem pretty confident. And we learn a little bit more about him. Like, what do we know about him at the moment?
It seemed like the most salient fact is that he had some sort of serious back injury. And I say that's the most salient fact because we take it as a given that his motive is what it seems to be, that an injury of that sort is why you encounter healthcare, why you start to think thoughts about it. A serious back injury like that is going to bother you pretty much every minute of every day. And so, one thing that's interesting about, of the many, many things that are fraught and emotional and intellectually interesting and awful about this whole thing, is that it's a young person who's having this interaction with an awful response to the state of healthcare, or whatever you want to say he's responding to and lashing out. A lot of young people go through their youth in good health and don't have much interaction with the healthcare system, right? And so I don't know, I found that very striking.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting because in a lot of ways he's what you would call, a normal, healthy looking guy. has a decent job, comes from a well-off family. Like you say, though, he has had an interaction with the healthcare system that seems to have impacted him. Kind of interestingly, it looks like or there was a manifesto. Ken Klippenstein has published that online, where he talks a little bit about why he did what he did, and he does not mention his own injuries. And it does not look like he was a client of United Healthcare. The manifesto instead just says, well, look, in America, we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, and we're 40th or whatever it is in terms of health outcomes, actually. And this is because all these fat cat CEOs are ripping us off, and so I'm going to kill one of them. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, at least thus far. If this is in fact a real manifesto, if this is in fact the shooter, et cetera, et
Sure.
cetera.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess, do you want to talk a little bit more about healthcare in America and like what do we have going on here? I mean, was he right that we have the most expensive healthcare system with pretty mediocre outcomes?
If I may, I'm not even going to try to tackle that question directly.
Fair
And
enough.
I'm just going to speak about where we seem to be as a country in terms of tackling societal problems. You know, the problems of healthcare and paying for healthcare and how much healthcare we should pay for and so forth are very complicated, very, very complex. And it's extremely difficult to deal with complex problems. And, I would argue that in plenty of situations, we need people who have really studied those problems to be the people who we try to find ways to trust. And we seem very far right now in this moment from dealing with complex problems like that. In our current moment, we've just elected Donald Trump to be president again. And who does Donald Trump want to put in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services? He wants to put in charge Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. doesn't even seem to know whether vaccines work. So, how distant, how unserious are we in this moment about tackling a complex problem like the incentives and organization of payment for healthcare through insurance that is private or social? I mean, like, people's eyes are probably already starting to glaze over as I start to like describe the sort of issues that, presumably are in the mind of the people contemplating this problem. I mean, these are major, major problems. These are major problems that affect everyone. But to deal with those problems seems distant right now. And I'm not really sure that we have the levels of trust necessary in the leadership that we have to even seriously be tackling these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to a view you'll see expressed sometimes as a famous quote from Martin Luther King: "A riot is the voice of the unheard." And to some extent, we're seeing that echoed, or a version of that repeated in this context. Elizabeth Warren said something to this effect. Let me go find what she said precisely. "The visceral response from people across the country who feel cheated, ripped off, and threatened by the vile practices of their insurance companies should be a warning to everyone in the healthcare system. Violence is never the answer, but people can only be pushed so far." That's sitting Senator Elizabeth Warren talking about these events and suggesting that, yeah, we do have problems with healthcare in this country. I mean, again, it is true. We do have the most, expensive per capita healthcare in the world. Our outcomes are not great, frankly, compared to our peer countries. And so there's this argument that, like you're saying, that the problem is so complex, we seem so far away from doing anything about it. Healthcare has been this giant national conversation for 15 years now. Um,
Oh,
I mean, depending on, right? I mean,
very
depending on how you want
conservatively.
to count that
Yeah.
exactly, a while. Certainly from Obamacare to reform, like the whole question of Obamacare and what it was going to be, Republican attacks on it or attempts to overturn it, and Democratic attempts to make it better. And has that really bent the curve on cost for the average American?
If I may say, Senator Warren is very expert. She's very expert on this exact matter. And Senator Warren would be the kind of person that if she was in leadership at HHS, I would think, well, we're on the path toward seriously addressing some of these issues, right? But instead, we've turned completely away from that, and we have a flight from seriousness. And shooting one man in the back is a flight from seriousness. It's a flight from trying to, I don't know. It's obviously unbelievably shocking and gets people's attention, and you'd be a fool to question that. But in itself, it doesn't say anything other than I'm extremely angry and maybe in pain. Physical pain can make people feel things that are not not necessarily what you might think it will make them feel. But it isn't itself a serious grappling with the problems.
I think that's right. I mean, we can see some of this as, I mean, we've talked about before the populist turn in American politics, the craving for simple narratives, things that are intelligible and that feel good. So, for example, recently on Blue Sky, New York Times commentator and author, various accolades, Roxane Gay responded by saying Luigi got them shook, talking about the plans for Atrium Health to forgive medical debt for about 11,000 people. I mean, except the part where the plan to forgive medical debt started months ago and doesn't actually have any connection with the shooting, but it's nice narrative, right? Oh, yeah, this killing has happened. It was righteous. Something is going to get done about it. It feels good. Whether it's true or not, that's a different question, unfortunately.
Millions and millions of people's experiences and the reality of their care and their insurance and whatever doesn't somehow magically get funneled into one just violent, crummy action. I mean, people are just making that story up. Humans are great storytellers and great story creators, and we imagine connections where there are none. I saw someone today, actually, it was one of our liberal currents authors, don't need to name her, but she mentioned on social media that she had heard from people who were skeptics of the vaccine for polio. She had talked to some of them earlier in the year, and they had a whole theory about the cause of polio. And it's just made up. It's just people just like their amazing human brain drawing connections between things and completely convincing themselves that they know what causes polio and that it's not what the scientists say, and people want to connect these broad things that are going on to very, very individual actions that are.
I mean, I agree with you that there's a certain human propensity to see significance in things, to find
Right.
patterns, to tell stories. And this doesn't mean that stories aren't
Yeah.
powerful.
Yes.
Stories are very powerful. Narratives are powerful. And this kind of gets to a broader topic that I wanted to bring up here, which is the idea of the repertoire of contention. A repertoire of contention, it's a term from social scientists who study protest. We study revolutions, various kinds of actions against the system. And the idea of the repertoire of contention is that it's sort of like the menu of things, the set of options available in your culture that are going to be intelligible to other people
Hmm.
as acts of protest. Like, what do we do? If we don't like a law, what do? We're going to have a march. We're all going to
Hmm.
gather in one place and we're going to walk to a different place. Maybe we'll hold some signs or make some speeches, but there's going to be this big walk that we all do. And that's intelligent, right? The walk, the actual physical act of walking has no connection whatsoever.
It's the American tradition of celebration through parades, dates to the 1800s,
Right, that it is a symbolic act. It's an act that is intelligible to the wider world and can get people to take account of your issue. Marches are absolutely, as you certainly know, are not the only thing in the repertoire of contention. Right, we've seen emerging these days the technique of blocking highways, as that's one thing you can do to try and say, I have a cause and I want something to
Mm-hmm.
get done about it. Things we don't see as much of anymore that used to be quite common, hunger strikes. Right, that was the thing. You just say, I'm not going to eat until something. People don't do, I mean, hunger strikes still happen, but they're not really at the top of everybody's mind when it comes to how do I express my discontent with the system. The important thing here is that it's not only nonviolent acts that are or can be in the repertoire of contention. Political violence is something that's in the repertoire of contention, as we're seeing very clearly today, right? That the CEO who is killed has he wasn't special, right? Killing him is not in a personal way he's not going to be replaced by somebody else who has better ideas about the healthcare system. He was killed as in a symbolic act, in a way that was clearly intelligible to everybody on the internet. And this is the case with a lot of political violence. So another recent example is the killing of Shinzo Abe, former prime minister of Japan, also shot by a lone gunman. Afterwards, the gunman was caught at the scene and he explains himself. And he says, well, you see, it's because of the Moonies. My elderly parents were scammed out of all of their life savings by this cult, the Moonies, the Unification Church, and now they are broke and destitute. And Shinzo Abe kind of legitimized the Moonies and gave them legitimacy in Japanese politics. And I was really mad about it, so I killed him. And this is long after he was a prime minister. He's kind of retired. He's not like an important figure in the same way that he used to be, but it's understood in this symbolic way. And people react to it and say, that kid had a point, actually. These people are a cult and they are scheming, defrauding elders from their money. Maybe we should do something about that, which seems like an analogous, disanalogous in other ways kind of example here.
Yeah, I think if you read the story, it is a good analogy.
Um, do you have other examples of political violence you want to talk about?
Well, one, I mean, a sort of political violence comes to mind, and it's the repeated white supremacist mass shootings we have seen. And
Absolutely.
this is obviously a despicable cause, but it seems clear that we have these online communities that are fostering these events. And when I say these events, I'm talking about El Paso, I'm talking about Tree of Life Synagogue, I'm talking about the Buffalo Grocery Store, I'm talking about the Charleston Church. And these are all thought to be white supremacism is the motive of all four of those. And it seems clear that these events are being fostered by and are ascribed symbolic meaning to by these terrible online communities. And I don't know what more to say. But when this event occurred and people started talking about political violence and it makes a statement, and I thought we have had many years now of several just absolutely nightmarish, horrible, violent political statements being made, and they're bad.
Well, I think there's something I want to dwell on in there where you said that they're being fostered by online communities, which is true. But there's sort of it's interesting to contrast that with other forms of political violence where you expect them to be, there's a cell, there's a hierarchy, there's orders, there's a plan, there's a group that you can infiltrate and find and, uncover their command structure. And that's not really what's
Right.
happening here. Right. What this is, to take another term of art from protest analysis, horizontalist. Right. There is no one in charge. There's no one handing out orders. There's just the zeitgeist. There's everybody posting all the time about what excites them or what doesn't excite them and what they like or what they don't like, what was cool and what wasn't cool. And people read that
Right.
and they respond to it. Right. And like you were talking about, the way that mass shootings in particular have entered the repertoire of contention on the right, right? That what you do if you have a grievance about your country, variously, because it has too many brown people in it, they have other kinds of great replacement conspiracy theories, whatever. Well, you get an AR-15 and you go to a crowded place. Maybe a place that has a symbolic connection, maybe not, maybe just a crowded place. And then you just kill as many people as you possibly can. And the we're not talking about, these are not discriminating target selection situations. It's just you kill as many people as you can. You try to get the highest body count. I mean, as some of them I think the Christchurch shooter explicitly talked about trying to get a higher body count than other shooters because they're reacting to each other, right? There's no one in charge, but people feed off one another. They feed off the imagery, they feed off the fame They feed off the reaction that these events generate on online. In other contexts, this has been referred to as
Right.
stochastic terrorism or distributed terrorism, where you have certain people who are what you might call thought leaders, who are putting out a message, who are amplifying ideas, who are, creating lists of targets, but who themselves never would dare touch any actual violence themselves. They don't engage in any of that. And it's just, people who are online and they see it and they get really angry and they think, this is something I can do to express that discontent. This is one way to discharge that
People
energy.
can do so much better.
Um,
It's so uncreative. It's so horrible. If you want
it's
attention for a cause, be more creative. Be better than. I mean, it's obviously. I mean, I don't know how you can be worse than taking out a gun and killing a bunch of people. There are ways to get attention for a good cause that are good. Young Mr. Mangione didn't have to shoot a man in the back. He could have made a public spectacle. He could have tried to embarrass Brian Thompson rather than kill him, rather than make his family suffer. I mean, like, I'm sure there would be some people who say, oh, well, nothing is more effective than killing. Is that true? I don't really, I would just think there's no proof of that. And there,
I mean, I think, like you say, it's a kind of spectacle, and the object of the spectacle can be.
it's a kind of spectacle, but you can make a different kind of spectacle. For instance, I don't want to bring up examples because people might say, well, that one wasn't very effective, but there's always a way to do something better than it's been done. There's always a way to do something worse than it's been done. Saying that, like, oh, things are pushed to a point and this has to be the answer, it doesn't have to be the answer.
I think that's actually something I want to stop and dwell on because it's important. And it's kind of what I've been trying to get at with the idea of the repertoire of contention, which is that violence is not a natural or inevitable outcome of public discontent. Um, Rather, it becomes one for various reasons. It becomes one en masse when it enters the repertoire of contention. When people think that's a cool way, that's an exciting way, that's an effective way of discharging my anger. Right, but it's not inevitable. I mean, one of the obvious examples to go to here is the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement in America did not organize itself on the idea that what black civil rights activists should do is find a bunch of people and kill them.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up what's got to be one of the most effective, protest movements ever. And it was explicitly nonviolent, and it was more successful than
Yes.
so many other.
Yeah, I want to focus on the idea that it was a tactical choice. And it was. The particular tactics picked by the civil rights movement were not natural responses to their situation. They
Yeah,
were chosen
they were
responses,
creative.
right? Rosa Parks did not sit down. I mean, I'm sure her feet were tired and she wanted to sit down on the bus, but she was also a longtime civil rights activist,
That's
and this
right.
was a planned event, planned in a particular way. Many civil rights actions were planned to generate a certain kind of reaction and a certain kind of coverage and a certain kind of political outcome. Historically, people don't, these days, anyways, people don't like nonviolence as much. It's not cool in the same. I'm sorry.
Then you
I
got
just
to
have to be honest
then
here.
th-
But it's effective. It's effective. I mean, historically speaking, you look at movements that work, movements that win, nonviolence
yeah,
is right there.
part of the creative activism that is needed then is to find a way to make it cool. That's got to be part of it. It's got to be part of it. You
Cool.
know, people think of the climate change activists and they have thrown soup on paintings. And a lot of people will say, well, that didn't work. And maybe it's because that wasn't cool. They didn't figure out a cool way to do what they were doing. They threw soup and everyone's like, what's with the throwing soup? And maybe some people thought it was cool and that's fine. And if you did, that's okay. But I mean, if you want to have an effect, maybe that's got to be part of the plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the soup thing is an interesting case because I mean, we're still talking about it.
There you go.
Everybody
There you
remembers
go.
the
They're
soup.
on. They did.
Um,
Maybe they went a long way toward being effective.
right? Was it effective?
Not everything people try is going to work, but
That's right.
shooting a man in the back is irrevocably horrible.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, looking at the situation that we're in, I suspect we're going to see more of it. So, for example, you drill down into the details of the Mangione case. It looks like the gun that he used was what's sometimes called a ghost gun, or more properly, a 3D printed gun. Um, in that in America, the way firearms are regulated, firearms have lots of parts. The part of the firearm that is like the gun from a regulatory perspective is the lower receiver. And everything else you can kind of buy much more easily, right? The bullets, the barrel, the slide, et cetera, you can just buy those as if they were accessories because they're not really the gun. And so what Maggiani did is he bought all the other stuff and then he just 3D printed a lower receiver in order to skirt firearms laws. But of course, in most of America, that's not even necessary. You can just buy a gun, a very effective one, right? What I'm trying to get at here is that we live in a country and we live at a time where access to firearms, I mean, you don't buy them at the corner store, but they're not hard to get.
You mentioned the
Um,
assassination of
I
Abe,
think
and there could be the most extreme contrast possible.
that's
The assassin
the doohickey.
had to do tons of research to try to figure out how to make anything that would approximate the effects of a gun and experimented at
That's
length to
right.
try to make it work. Apparently succeeded in the end,
Yeah.
but
I mean, he
yeah.
he got there eventually, but yes, he had to do it took, it's a substantially higher
Right.
activation energy to get to a gun in Japan than it is in America. The other thing that I was very struck by in the Mangione case is target identification, that he was able to pick a person, determine where they would be and how to access them. And he was able to do this all through publicly available information, right? And if you follow open source intelligence at all, the whole geolocation subculture, there is an enormous amount of information
Hmm.
available on the internet these days. And if you know what you're doing, if you study the techniques, you can find people, specific people, without being a hacker and penetrating computer systems or doing any of the fancy stuff. It's just like, oh yeah, you find their Instagram and you look at the photos and you are able to geolocate, oh, this is the coffee shop where they're
Hmm.
always at. And that's very doable. And so, given the cultural impact that Mangione is having, given the availability of firearms, given the availability of open source
Samantha, I
intelligence
see where your
techniques,
prediction is coming from,
I
but I don't like it. I don't like it.
look here on neoliberalism. Sometimes it's our job to just confront the
Yeah.
world as it is. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is not what's about to happen, but it fits a pattern.
That is bleak. That is really bleak.
Yes. I mean, obviously, a lot of people on the internet are excited right now. They think, oh, that would be great. Of course,
Oh my God.
it's putting the fear of God into these fat cats, and more people should do it. The thing about this kind of political violence is, well, once you open that particular bottle, it's hard to get the genie back into it. It's hard to control who and what.
whatever the other side is to you, whatever the other side is to you, they are also people and they are going to react. And, it's just, one thing leads to another.
Yes, certainly in other countries and other contexts, things have gone badly. If you Google the years of lead on Wikipedia, you'll find a disambiguation page because there's completely different countries that have had long periods known as the years of lead because the right and the left were shooting each other all the time. So it's certainly, I mean, again, historically in the 20th century, leftist activists of various kinds, famously the Red Army faction, other kinds of left activists, turned to violence as a way to advance their agenda. I mean, personally, I live not that far from where Alexander Berkman shot Henry Clay Frick. Failed to kill him, but did definitely shoot the man. Right, for those who don't know who these people are, Alexander Berkman was an anarchist friend of Emma Goldman. Henry Clay Frick was one of the most hard-hearted, hard-handed capitalists of the Gilded Age, a coke magnate. They still make coke around here, by the way. In any event, Berkman tries to shoot him, fails. So certainly there's nothing inherent to progressive politics or to leftist politics that precludes political violence entering into the repertoire of contention. I can see you
But
shaking your head
yeah,
there.
Not out of disagreement, just out of, it all sounds pretty miserable.
I think that's right. I'm not trying to stand up
No,
for the
no, I don't.
American healthcare industry here. For listeners out there, I want to be clear, this is not, it's not my intention in any of what I've said to endorse the practices of the American healthcare industry exactly as they are. Healthcare reform has been a continual topic in American politics for decades now for reasons, right, that the system we have isn't working very well. But what I'm trying to talk about today is just to fit this particular act of political violence into, well, what do we know from looking at history about political violence as an aspect of political activism, as an element of repertoires of
Yeah, we need,
contention?
at all levels of society, we need healthy responses to legitimate problems. It's always going to be on all sides that that's needed. We can all do better.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I've written about this a little bit for liberal currents about the idea of populism. That one of the things that populism wants to tell you is that the problems are simple. You're good, right? You're a good person. There are villains far away or very different from you who are oppressing you. And they're the source of the problem. And if we just get rid of the villain, we'll be able to fix everything easily without any cost to you, right? Populism sells you a simple view of the world, and it's a comforting view because you're a good person. And you don't know any bad people personally, right? Everybody you know is a good person. The villains are, they're the CEOs, they're the 1%. They're
I was going to say, and those narratives become a lot more plausible when the villains are super, super, super rich and have seemingly sealed themselves away. Do you know what I mean? I mean, think
That's
about
right.
any fictional movie or whatever that you've seen from childhood, and like what are the villains in all sorts of stories like? All sorts of stories is the villain is sealed away, is a loner, and
No, I think you can make the case that to some extent, material conditions in the United States have made it easy to tell these kinds of stories because there are billionaires, and many of them do seem like pretty awful people who hate hate workers and, want just an excuse to extract a little bit more. They have $1 billion and that ain't enough. And so they make an easy villain. Is that the problem with our healthcare system? Not really, but
yeah,
that,
yeah.
opens up this other can of worms. Like all those complexities you
No,
didn't want to talk about at the start of
it's a
this conversation.
conversation for people who are more expert in it than me. I think, there's a reason you have a specialty of health economics, people who really, really are in the weeds and understand these things on a better level than even a generalist economist does. And, that's why I emphasize this notion of trust. And, a lot of people have been saying, in the wake of the election of Trump, it really signifies a sliding, we say democratic backsliding, but, along with that, people are talking about, heading toward being a low trust society instead of a high trust society. And if you can't trust scientists, you can't trust economists, you can't trust health economists, how can we come up with good solutions to inevitably complex problems if we don't have trust in experts? And I'm not saying that the experts automatically merit trust. I'm saying that trust has to be fostered for the idea of expertise to be leverageable at all. And we seem to be failing at that, and the failure can be put on the experts in part and it can be put elsewhere in part. But this is a major, major problem. If we want to productively tackle problems, not only do we have to be responsive to people as they try to give voice to problems. But when we reject science, when we reject expertise just out of hand, we are setting ourselves up for a very difficult situation. I see people saying that Robert Kennedy Jr. is about to start the conversation about vaccines. Well, I'm sorry, the conversation about vaccines has been going on for many decades and centuries. If you want to seriously engage in that conversation and you want to become knowledgeable about science and maybe see why you should put some trust in scientists in that regard, I'd welcome that. But that's the work that needs to be done to like improve healthcare outcomes in this society. We're on the verge of maybe having some terrible healthcare outcomes simply because we have decided to reject scientific expertise. And, I would just say the same goes for health economics and the same goes for paying for healthcare, right? If we're just going to reject the expertise of health economists because we don't trust them and we don't care to figure out why we should trust them, we got very, very rough times ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. This all does the Again, the use of political violence, the valorization of political violence, the turn towards populist narratives reflects, like you say, a society that is losing trust in each other, losing trust in expertise, losing trust in institutions to solve problems, whether that is politicians or policymakers or scientists, losing trust in people whose expertise you need to deal with a complex world and to make things better rather than making things worse. And as we lose the kind of trust that is necessary for dealing with complex problems, we start to look towards simpler but maybe more cathartic solutions, things that deliver a short-term spectacle you can see on your screen rather than a long-term policy that makes things better. That unfortunately appears to be the future we're heading towards, at least in the near term. And here at Neon Liberalism, we'll be here to document all of it going forward. So, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you all again next week.